it's super busy. We've been we're preparing to do some modest scaling, basically, of all the stuff around Team Topologies and fast flow and this kind of thing. So it's quite an exciting time, but there's an awful lot of stuff to do, basically.
Modest scaling. What does that?
It depends how you count it right now, but going from a team of, let's say, 8-ish people, depending on how you count it, to twice that by the end of this year, and then twice that again by the end of 2024, and then we'll see.
Nice.
So, yeah, smallish numbers. We're not talking about hundreds or thousands of people, but definitely in terms of kind of ambition and customer success stories and things like that. So it's cool. It's good. It feels like the right time. To be honest, the right time to do that was actually about 2 years ago, but for various reasons we didn't do it.
Right.
But anyway, so this is the next best time to do it.
How have, because I know you obviously released the book and things like that, Team Topologies. Is it like more like the validation of like what you've created inside of things, and that's why now you've reached a stage where you're like, okay, now you're kind of seeing it in action?
To some extent, the book Team Topologies was the right book at the right time, because there's lots of ideas floating around in terms of size of team, in terms of socio-technical systems, in terms of Conway's Law, and a bunch of these other things. So someone else could have come along with a book that had similar themes and had some success. I think what we did is to augment it with language, quite specific language that was carefully chosen, and other concepts like team interaction modes. So I think it's fair to say it's the first approach to thinking about teams working together, building software, or just teams working together in general, really, that thinks about the interactions between teams rather than just the types of team and what they do.
Right.
Because if you think about and specify interactions and use that as an enabling constraint on a complex adaptive system, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about an organization with multiple actors and that kind of thing. So you've got some constraints on the language, constraints on the kind of effectively the operating model that you might adopt in this context. Then what starts to happen is that we get some interesting, more predictability in the behavior that emerges. And so so we're able to maybe reason a bit better or have more structured conversations about how we might want to run things in the organization. And it ends up being quite powerful and quite a real catalyst for helping organizations to work in a much better way. But it's really not counterintuitive. It's really unfamiliar to lots of people. Lots of people are familiar with thinking about managing stuff. Let's manage all the things, right? Rather than how can we set things up so we don't need to manage them? And lots of people are familiar with thinking about the organization like a machine. How can we make this better? How can we specify things better? How can we oil the machine better? How can we get people like squeeze more work out of them, more typing out of them, all this nonsense? And so helping people to see things in a different way, helping to see things in terms of an ecosystem, in terms of shaping behaviors and deliberately constraining the ways in which teams work together in order to become more effective, turns out to be quite a radical approach, basically, even though it's kind of obvious to those of us who have been working in this space for quite a while and in other organizations too, other spaces too. But particularly those of us who kind of understand software and APIs and this kind of thing, abstractions and flow and blah, blah, blah. It's all relatively obvious. But to people who are not familiar with this stuff, it's quite new.
I'm really intrigued because the Team Topologies, just for me to kind of understand fully, is it because it's like seems like a mixture of kind of like sociology constructs, right? Behavioral constructs in like kind of what you're saying. So almost like got a sociology lens to it. On like how do we kind of function as a mini society, which is kind of like the organization, like at a micro level, and then obviously the psychology, behavioral elements of individuals within each team and the constraints, which is kind of like how do you get effective people and productive people. But whether that applies to sizes of businesses, because I guess if you're tiny, would Team Topologies be useful to like only certain companies of certain sizes, do you think? Or is it like a generic like you could be just a delivery team, like a small delivery team, and it's not specific.
So what we found is that actually, so I did some work with a customer way back in like 2015, and they were a startup in the video advertising space in the UK. Because apparently prior to 2015, adverts for television, at least in the UK, were burned onto a DVD and put on a motorcycle courier and sent across London from one studio to another. 2015. This is like well after AWS and cloud and everything else. But this is so. I mean, it seems mad, but anyway, that's what happened. It's partly the size of the assets and everything. It's very expensive and didn't have ubiquitous fiber and all that kind of stuff back in 2015. Anyway, so that's what the startup was doing, was actually taking TV advertising and running it through processing and blah blah blah, review cycles, and then making it available on the internet. And it seems kind of obvious these days, but it's only a few years ago. Anyway, and they got to about 15 people in size, and started to see some of the problems that we talk about in the Team Topologies book, because the TT book is based on stuff that partly based on problems that we've seen, and that influenced some of the language and thinking, like particularly the influence of tools on behavior of teams. Like if you've got a group of people who don't have access to a particular tool, or only have read-only access rather than edit access, and this kind of thing, then it can have a really strong effect on how behavior of that organization starts to emerge. And in this particular case, it was around kind of what is a platform. It was around kind of how much cognitive load can we reasonably expect the front-end development teams to take on. Do they really need to know about the inner workings of the video processing software, which is complicated anyway, because it's doing MP4, whatever. It wasn't even just MP4, it was other kind of transcoding stuff as well. But like the way in which that particular software was configured was really awkward, because it was running on a Windows machine, but they were running it inside AWS in a Linux kind of environment, and blah, 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 like all of this kind of stuff. And we're thinking, there's a cognitive load thing going on here. We didn't call it that at the time, but we started thinking through, well, what's the mental effort, if you like, that these people need to go under? And is that reasonable? Is that the right thing for them to have to think about? Or surely they should be more focused on kind of the user experience of the video editing workflow and blah, 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 or video approval workflow it was in this case. Anyway, this kind of thing. So actually, the short version, the short answer to your question is the patterns in Team Topologies do seem to apply at quite small organization sizes. Like we've seen around about 15, 20 people, it starts to become valuable thinking through where we're going to put these kind of boundaries, where we're going to put these, what is the platform, what in terms of cognitive load, in terms of different kind of technology, and setting things up so that you don't want to make decisions too early because you might not have enough information, but at the same time, if you think that you don't have these kind of problems until you're like 250 people, then you're mistaken. Like these kind of challenges around cognitive load and flow and Conway's law definitely start to kick in probably much sooner than most organizations realize.
And that's irrespective then of like the talent hiring, I guess, like the process to kind of come in, and like the cultural values and like what you're hiring for.
You could probably hire for people who are, in fact, this is really interesting actually. We've just started using a new kind of so-called social listening tool, which goes out there and kind of searches for, in this case, new material posts and articles and mentions and things that are mentioned in Team Topologies, as you'd expect. And we're increasingly seeing quite large firms, banks, insurers, automobile manufacturers, and so on, including the phrase Team Topologies in their job specifications or in RFPs. So in requests for proposals from consultancies, saying, well, basically, like some degree of Team Topologies awareness and knowledge, particularly in terms of enabling teams, is now starting to creep in as a requirement. So it depends who, you can probably hire for people who get this stuff already. And so then you'll be able to make more progress. If you like, you have to be able to have better conversations. But ultimately, you might have bought yourself more runway, more time. If you don't have a load of legacy technologies, you've bought yourself a bit more time, and so on and so on. If you've bought people who are happy to do a bit of Java, a bit of Python, a bit of Go, something else, they don't see themselves as a Java developer or a .NET developer, you've bought yourself a bit more kind of flexibility and that kind of thing. So yes, you can hire for a better fit in this kind of world, but you're still constrained by, kind of in a nice way, really. You still got constraints in terms of cognitive load and the amount of stuff, the size of a service that a team can actually seriously properly look after in a 24/7 sense, and be able to have all that domain context around it, and deal with all of the deployment stuff and the security stuff and so on and so on. Even if they're using a platform, they still have to be aware enough of all of these, how it all fits together, and where the dragons are, if you like, on the map. So yes, hiring helps for sure, but you've still got the same challenges ultimately. It's just that you might not hit the real challenges quite so soon, as if you've got a different kind of set of people. But I think that I think you're right. I think that there's Team Topologies, the book is and the whole approach is it's sort of difficult to pigeonhole. It's not a technology book. It's not a business book. It's not an HR, human resources book. It's a combination of all of these things and more, because it's not an architecture book, but it deals with architecture and so on. It includes elements of all these things because that's the nature of the problem. That's what we do when we build modern business software systems. Cool, right? If you're writing software for a Raspberry Pi to go into like some smart doorbell or something like that, or some kind of meteorological station or agricultural soil monitor thing, fine. Like it's a piece of software. It sits there, it does its thing, and reports data back or whatever. So it's relatively technology centric. But when we're talking about business software systems that are encoding, decision making workflows, allowing customers access to upload a document or start a workflow or something, then the nature of the problem in that kind of space, which is arguably the majority of software development these days, is in that kind of business enabling space, then the nature of what we need to do is not just technology by any stretch of the imagination. Technology is a part of it, but we have to think about like the relationship between the domains we're working in. We have to think about the relationship between the different teams working together. Like, do they understand? They have the same understanding? Are there different like subdomains and whatnot? How are we going to respond to failure? All of the stuff we've learned about DevOps and SRE and so on, platform engineering over the last like 15, 20 years. Like, what's our organizational response to that? Have we got the right culture to enable a sensible response to that, and to be able to learn quickly from something that's gone wrong in production? Or we're going to clamp down on it and then make people leave and make people feel fearful, and so on and so on. This stuff is not a technology problem. Technology is a part of it, but it's interwoven with a whole load of other dimensions.
Which is probably why it did so well, I guess.
I'd like to think so. And I think some of the ideas are useful. The challenge is that quite a few people don't bother reading to the end of the book. They read like the first section or the first few chapters and go, yeah, I get it, this is fine. And then we have to go, look, if you'd read like the second half of the book, or certainly the last part, you'd realize that your conception of what we're talking about is just way too basic. It's way off the mark. So to the extent that now I actually recommend that people start at the back of the book and almost read the book backwards. And maybe we should have written it in
a different order.
We literally had like a CEO he claimed to have read the book. This is what one customer a couple of years ago claimed to have read the book, we're in the middle of a workshop, and genuinely he thought that these changes to teams and team boundaries for flow and all this stuff, he thought it would take maybe 3 weeks. And this is an organization of many hundreds of people with like, I don't know what it was, billions of revenue, whatever. Certainly hundreds of millions of revenue, for sure, probably billions. And we have to say, oh, right. So it's going to take a bit more than 3 weeks. This is a long-term, a long-term endeavor here, because effectively you're rewiring your business.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. And there's definitely work to do on that aspect, which is like, well, how long does all of this change take? What are the steps that you might expect us to take? Because people read the book and they go, wow, this sounds amazing. And then possibly have, too low an expectation or too modest an expectation of what the implications really are. Like, we maybe didn't spell out the implications.
To be fair, though, I was talking about this to others. I've read like loads of books and listen to loads of podcasts. And when I'm doing it, I don't know why, maybe it's like a complete naivety, but every time I'm listening and it makes loads of sense, I think like I've obviously learned quite a lot. And I'm like, wow, that's great, so interesting. However, what I haven't done is change my habit. So for some unknown reason, I think I've acquired knowledge, but changed nothing, if that makes sense. And somehow believe that because I acquired the knowledge, that somehow I'm going to like change because I acquired the knowledge. But actually, I'm habitual. So until my habits change in relation to the things I've learned, I kind of then learn still the hard way, if that makes sense. So then I still make the mistakes, even though they're already well documented by other people. And then I'm like, yeah, that was kind of textbook. I mean, literally it was textbook because it wasn't a book, and I still made the mistake despite kind of like reading it. So it is quite hard to like think that just because you've read something, suddenly you've also changed, or your behaviour's changed, or your habits have changed, and that does take time. And it's something I've kind of clocked where after I've failed, I then realised it was already documented, and I'm like, yeah, I suppose that shouldn't have technically happened, considering I did read that stuff. So it is definitely not going to be fast for people.
That's actually, so I agree with you, and that actually ends up being a business opportunity for us, because what we've started to do is to offer. So we do training. We've got on-demand video training, fairly standard stuff, and it's it has a value. It's got a certain amount of impact. It's kind of like a step off the floor, if you like, a step up, but not many steps. It doesn't take you to the top of the stairs, top of the ladder. But hundreds of people potentially in the organization can take that kind of training asynchronously, and eventually they've all watched something at the very least. But we also do like group learning sessions, smaller sessions, like 15 people sessions, and that can act like a catalyst because people see their peers learning things. Right. And we know from kind of pedagogy and kind of psychology of learning that actually a lot of learning happens when people see their peers learning rather than hearing it from the teacher. But we've taken one step further, which is actually start offering reflective learning sessions. So let's say people have been on a workshop or an online training course or something, whatever, or they've read a book or they watched a talk or a video. Bring people together and help them to reflect on what they've seen, but in a semi-guided way. Because then with the embedding, with that time for reflection, that's where additional learning happens. If you don't do that, then the organization has spent 10,000 on some video training, and basically that just goes down the toilet because people haven't got time to reflect. Learning only happens with a reflection. Reflection on that, on the original learning, and so on and so on. And so this then becomes like this helping organizations to guide people on kind of learning journeys and helping them to start to implement it becomes a key part to make any of this stuff work. And that's part of the scaling stuff I mentioned before. Continuous delivery as a practice. When was the book published? 2010. What's that? We're now in the middle of 2023, 13 years ago, right? We're doing some work with a customer in the UK. They do financial software. There's someone in the organization in charge of products, and this person had never heard of continuous delivery. I mean, this is work we were doing earlier this year. So that's 13 years after the book was published, never heard of continuous delivery for digital products. I mean, you're thinking, wow, that's pretty special. No wonder, there are problems in the organization around product delivery of digital products, right? But even more so than that, like the ideas in continuous delivery are verging on counterintuitive, like merge your code into trunk or main every day. Like people go, wow, what's this? What is this voodoo? I like to have a nice long-lived branch in my GitHub repository. Thank you very much. Instead, and even when the CD techniques and trunk-based development and so on have been effectively proven, have been shown to indicate predict higher organizational performance. Yeah. So all the accelerate stuff and state of results reports, people are still like fingers in their ears. No, that can never work here. So there's this, like you said before, we're not missing the practices.
Yeah,
the practices are known, the practices are invented, they're effectively as close to proven as we're able to get. But it takes a long time. It's like an oil tanker, like opinion and existing ways of working and stuff like this. Particularly when things initially sound very different to their expected way of working, and they can't get a handle on how that might be better for that organization, and it needs a lot of other stuff in place, and it needs a rethink, like a mental framing. Like instead of the classic one is like, instead of having to manage all dependencies, how do we reshape the organization so we don't need to manage dependencies? That kind of thing. It's like complete like mind exploding for people when you start talking to them about that. And eventually some of them get it, but many of them it's like you're talking Klingon.
Yeah, it is tough though. I guess from like we're saying, like you can be educated but not implement the education because your habits are a certain way, and you then have to learn almost sometimes trial by fire. Some people learn literally trial by fire, as in like even though they've seen other people do it, they only learn by doing it wrong themselves, and then they're like, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. Like now I've actually experienced it. Now I actually understand it. But the theory isn't always totally understandable. But I was going to ask you about all the what your kind of take is on the because I know you've done obviously the Dora stuff and the DevOps reports, and you've been involved in all those things, and then the platform the rise of the platform engineering, and what you think all of that means in relation to I guess the team topology stuff and the way teams operate, and what your take on it is as an industry, and then also probably from the book.
I did my first talk on DevOps in 2010 in Hamburg at DevOps Days Hamburg. That's pretty early on. That was like literally like 2 weeks after the continuous delivery books was published and blah, blah, blah. So I've been involved in this kind of space for, what's that now, 13 years. DevOps was an amazing kind of movement that really transformed how IT software systems were specified and built and run. I mean, the value from that movement has just been amazing. But of course, now DevOps means, I don't know, something like infrastructure automation or like CI/CD, deployment pipelines, that kind of stuff. And it's like the meaning of that word is now shrunk down to like a really small slice of where the value really is. Okay, fine. So then what came along? SRE, Site Reliability Engineering from Google. Now that started in 2003, pre-cloud, as a set of principles, right? You've got to remember that. That was even SRE is pre-DevOps. SRE comes along, with some quite impressive, balancing of technology and social contracts, social dynamics in there, really. In terms of how Google talks about how they do it. But then SRE has sort of become in some circles kind of like, well, a lot of really gnarly and awkward stuff around reliability and performance and observability and a few of these other things. And then people are looking for the next shiny thing that's going to fix all of their problems. Because DevOps didn't fix their problems and SRE didn't fix their problems, and maybe platform engineering is going to fix all our problems. Well, if you're thinking like that, then platform engineering isn't going to fix your problems. That's sad to say. It's not going to do it because you're thinking about it in the wrong way. The organizations that found DevOps useful are the ones that change their culture, change their ways of working, change the way they learn, change the way that decisions are not just the way that decisions are made, but where decisions are made. So decisions are pushed down into semi-autonomous units called teams that then can execute with full context. And likewise, the organizations that found SRE really valuable and helped to do it are the organizations that understood the underlying intention and dynamics around SRE that Google talk about. The ones that failed are the ones that created a separate SRE team, and then the SRE team is the one that like runs the services in production on behalf of developers. Well, that's just back to the old DevOps stuff from like 2008. Like, what's the point of that?
Yeah. Definitely.
And the same will be true of platform engineering. The organizations that expect like platform engineering to like somehow magically take away all the hassle from developers have got it all wrong. And that's why in the Team Topologies book we were very careful to talk about platforms in terms of things that improve flow and reduce cognitive load. They need to be like, they need to have like good product management around them. Think about developer experience, user experience in general, talk about user needs, actually talk to the development teams, understand what they actually need and try and understand what their current experience is. And if it's not a good experience, then go and fix it. And all this kind of stuff, so there'll be loads of organizations that are just rolling out platform engineering and don't take on board any of that stuff at all. And they're going to fail.
Yeah.
And they're going to blame it on platform engineering, and then there'll be something else that comes along after that. We definitely contributed to the rise of this thing kind of around platform engineering. And I think for the organizations that really understand it and really take the time to understand the dynamics around it, they're going to succeed. They're going to do really, really well. It's going to really help. The organizations that pay lip service to it and just hire a load of platform engineers and expect things magically to work out, they're not going to get any value out of it at all.
Yeah.
Because they're not changed fundamentally how the organization works.
It's also one of those spaces, like, if you look at normal product management and to have product owners or somebody of which you can steer direction, or domain experts, essentially, that kind of understand how to solve the problem potentially differently because they've been exposed to it. And then to have product managers who are technical enough, but also good enough, I guess, from the soft skills perspective, and can like manage in terms of product management properly, like ideation of like how the problems can get solved. That's quite a lot of niche capability. So I think as a principle, it absolutely makes sense. So when I look at platform engineering, trying to operationalize some efficiency across the business and not having loads of divergence across the organization makes loads of sense. Consistency kind of makes sense if you can achieve it. Commoditization of things makes sense if you can achieve it well and it kind of meets enough of the balance. But I think because it's such a broad space, I do wonder what's going to happen over time where people, like you've just said, people will adopt it, they'll try and execute on it, and the execution bit's going to be really hard because the talent that you might need to execute well on it is finite and also going to be quite hard. So it will be quite a tricky thing to probably, I imagine a lot of people might end up in a bit of a mess without recognizing that was going to happen, but feel like they did everything correct. If you see what I mean. They're like, but I did all the things. I feel like I did all the things that people said I should do, but it still, for some reason, hasn't worked out very well. And now we've got this thing in the business that's like not really working as well as we thought it might.
And there'll be kind of pendulum swings where one investment cycle or one particular CTO or CEO, they'll invest in that approach, and then someone else will come in and look at the costs of doing that kind of approach with product managers and platform and doing loads of UX and things like this with internal teams, and they go, wow, this is really crazy. Let's just cut all these costs, and then it'll go back to an old style IT department where you have to raise a Jira ticket or something like this, or ServiceNow ticket, and it'll be back to the bad old days of 2007 again. And then that will take 3, 4, 5 years in that organization to clear up. The organization will probably fail or get bought by someone else, and blah blah blah. So there's a bit of a cyclic thing there. And maybe that sounds really cynical. I think what we do have now, obviously 2023, is we've got plenty of experienced digital product managers on the market in general. People experienced with managing digital products at scale for consumers and B2B and B2C audiences. Now, all of that, and we've got loads of people who've got good UX, user experience, awareness, and developer experience, and so on and so on. These skills are already inside these kind of organizations. They're just customer-facing, external customer-facing. So we don't have to look outside the organization to find these skills often. They're already in the organization. We can use that expertise there and bring it inside the organization to focus on this internal platform. It's not even like we've already got the organizations that are already doing that stuff for their external customers, whoever they are already in a position of advantage. Now, if you're not doing any user persona stuff or UX or proper product management, then you're in a bad place anyway. So you need to fix that, whatever happens. But it's not like we're having to fish around in the dark for this stuff. Like, you've got people in the organization who literally know about user experience and developer experience and product roadmaps and life cycles and API management and all of this stuff, because you're doing it already externally.
Do you think you can do that though? Do you think that's true? Do you think a product manager with quite a complex domain can just apply product management skills? And this is where I'm going to sound cynical, so I need to be kind of caveated, because I'm sure people can do it, but it's quite hard. It's quite a hard thing to then be able to, because you've got a difference between like doing user research and speaking to users, which is one piece, and then hearing like what people are struggling with and where the time's going and what they're frustrated by. But then taking that and coming up with like ideating on a solution, and then also prioritizing like how to roadmap those things, as kind of feature sets, to say, right, okay, we've got these like epics, and these are the epics of the problems, and then this is because how it gets solved in the end is the bit that's got to be valuable outside of like knowing what needs to be solved, and that takes a certain level of creativity potentially and research and kind of understanding by the team, which is the hard bit as well. And then that's like, that's like a real good, like a good team that can kind of function well on like figuring it all out well and coming up with ideas under the research and then testing them out and then seeing if they've got value. And so I don't know, like that as an internal thing whilst you're in the way, I suppose, of the delivery of also things that are like that are the business, like financial driven services, is quite a complex. Like, I still think it's right because I've done it myself, so I don't. It's kind of weird because but I still think it's quite a hard thing, because the difference maybe between you as a business service and you as an internal product means there's demand hitting you that is impeding potentially the business services at a level of scale, because you're basically the conduit that a service in isolation wouldn't have, if you see what I mean.
Like, ultimately, the business services should be run as an internal product. I mean, that's the way to make it scale. That's how Amazon Web Services run it. True. And they've not had any problem scaling. In fact, we know that when they add a new person, they get more than one person's worth of extra activity out of them because of their scaling, their power scaling laws. They get a greater than 1x scaling for new people, whereas most organizations get something like 0.85. There's a great book by Jeffrey West called Scale, and it talks about all of this kind of stuff, like how does scaling work and what kind of things you need to do to make scaling super linear or less than linear and all this kind of stuff. And Amazon have got that kind of they worked it out a long time ago, and a lot of that stuff is around clear interfaces and the right kind of abstractions at the right point, and refusing to allow coupling. Absolutely refusing to allow certain kinds of internal coupling, which most organizations don't think about. A lot of the stuff we're doing now comes out of the Team Topologies book is around hidden coupling. I mean, there's nothing new. Coupling has been a thing in the software, particularly in software research, since when? 1950s, 60s probably. Like, we're not saying it's new, it's just that we've thankfully been able to shine a light on it again as a thing that needs addressing. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying product management for internal platforms is easy. What I'm saying is that we don't have to look far to find people who can help us, because those people are literally already inside most of these organizations. And given that most organizations are starting from such a low baseline around kind of product thinking in the platform type space, whether it's a data platform or a design platform or an infrastructure platform or whatever, it was starting from such a low baseline that, to be honest, even if we do just do a quick NPS survey, like quick developer survey, and we get like some rough 1 to 5 Likert scale answers back, we're doing pretty well. Like the ability to make some improvements in this space is low hanging fruit. To be able to do it really, really well, I mean, but doing product management really, really well is hard anyway.
True.
I don't think it's fundamentally different. I think it's the same problem. It's the same kind of fractal. We've zoomed in a bit more internally, and it's the same set dynamics. The stuff that's obviously different is you don't get millions of users. You can't do those kind of A/B experiments or multivariate experiments or whatever, where you've got millions of users and therefore like high statistical confidence, you have to use techniques that are more qualitative, as in surveys and talking to individuals one-to-one and stuff like that. But taking on some of that discipline around, well, let's treat the platform as if it's optional. Let's treat the platform as if these development teams have the choice to come to us and use it or not. It just sets up such a better dynamic inside the organization. Like we can treat each other as equals and have a proper conversation rather than IT saying, developers, you've got to use this system. You've got to use it, otherwise we're not letting you deploy it. Well, really? Is that a great starting point for like working together? No. And so on. A lot of these other dynamics historically that have been really, really unhelpful. So using this kind of sort of treating the internal dynamics a bit like an external market dynamic, but without being silly. Like we're not going to start charging internal teams for using our API on a request by request basis. That feels probably a bit silly for most organizations. But certainly, like taking I don't know what it is, like taking 80% of the kind of external market dynamics as if it were an external product, external company, and bringing that into our internal platform, using a lot of that discipline, and then filling in the blanks with actual conversations where we just go and talk to someone, like just go and have a coffee with someone and ask them what they need, that kind of thing. So it's not exactly the same, but I think we can bring in a lot of value from people with existing product management kind of and UX and developer experience focus, and get a huge chunk of the way to what good looks like.
Did you do anything? Have you seen anything with the space element? I only came across it. Literally, I don't know a huge amount. I literally came across it today. Somebody kind of mentioned to me passing this productivity, developer productivity.
It looks really interesting. Yeah. This is the stuff from Nicole Forsgren and her crew, isn't it? Yeah, I've not really dived down into it, to be honest, around developer productivity. But if it's anything which makes developer productivity or the discussion around it better than what McKinsey did the other week,
I don't know.
Their report on developer productivity, which was absolutely mad, completely mad. Like it basically said you need to measure how many lines of code your developer is coding out every day. I was like, are you serious? Like this is. It was always like a joke. Lots of people thought it was a joke.
Wow.
But apparently it was serious. McKinsey are touting that around to boardrooms around the world as if it's a thing like, get your developers coding more. Really?
Wow.
Are you sure?
Wow, that is bad. I thought people use that as an example of what it isn't it? Like I'm sure that actually has come up in in other things about what you wouldn't measure. That's kind of funny, a little bit ironic, I guess, like an ironic white paper or something.
Maybe it was that. Let's hope it was that.
So anyway, I know it's kind of late, obviously, as well, where you are. So I won't take too much of your time.
That's all right. I can talk all day, as you can probably tell.
Yeah,
right?
No, it is. It's really, really good, and I've kind of like it's great having you on. Are you ever back down this way?
Not in London very often. I'm actually in London later in September.
Yeah, are you going to be travelling around then? Do you think more, or do you think you'll try and do
a little bit more? So we're just trying to work out exactly how that works, and it's quite an interesting problem as well, because I don't want to start incurring a huge carbon like CO2 budget for flying around, but at the same time, meeting someone face to face is obviously one of the best ways of building trust. And a big chunk of the stuff in the Team Topologies book is about thinking about where trust boundaries live, all the Dunbar's number stuff, because then with high trust, we can get a high-performing team. With a high-performing team, the team members trust each other to do the right thing in the right context, and so we can go much more quickly, and blah, 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 blah. So a lot of stuff I'm thinking about is applying Team Topologies to not just my businesses as operational kind of units or actually groups of companies in one case, but also to a network. So we've got a network of partners and enthusiasts. We call them advocates. So applying it to a kind of worldwide network of people and organizations who have an interest in Team Topologies and fast flow, but interested ultimately in making the world a better place for people who are working in these industries. That's our mission, is around making things more like humane and more effective. and thinking through like how that works, where do the trust boundaries sit inside a network. So that's my kind of nerdy kind of interest in this stuff here. But it's just amazing to be able to apply Team Topologies in these multiple different contexts and stretch the principles a bit and see where the edges of the ideas are. But so far, it's proven really useful to think about how to organize not just for fast flow, but for distributed decision making. Because we've got people across pretty much every time zone, basically now, almost every time zone, and just where we need to move really quickly on things because the opportunity is there, and the decisions can't come through to a single person or a single small group all the time, which is true of any organization, right? But we're hitting these challenges now at a much smaller size, much smaller, let's say, employee size or FTE size than many organizations might do, because of the interest in the Team Topologies book and in fast flow in general. We're having to hit some interesting sort of scaling and decision making and operating model. We're having to deal with these kind of aspects sort of now, even though we're, let's say less than 15 people involved, because of what's happening in the kind of wider network. So yeah, it's great to have the Team Topologies book, because we just dip in there and use the ideas to help us work out how to navigate that kind of those kind of decisions.
Did that is it because it's you're remote? Is that what the challenge is, or is it because you're dispersed for different time zones? Because they're quite, I don't know if they're similar-ish things, where it's the nature of just not being together and you can't like just go over to someone's desk or side chat.
It's a really good question, because of course, so we did a second book to Team Topologies called Remote Team Interactions Workbook, which is like a thin volume which came out in early 2022. It's basically like an appendix to the main Team Topologies book, where we wrote it in the middle of lockdown and all the COVID stuff, and so everyone's now hybrid. Every organization has now got some people working from home some days. It's just the new normal. The new normal is you can never guarantee that you'll be able to just walk up to someone. Like, even if you're in the same city, you might be in two different office buildings. Even if you're in the same office building, you're on two different floors, and one of you is on a floor which the other person can't access because it's a higher security level or whatever. Yeah. So you're communicating through video call, Slack, my God, Teams if you're very unlucky, or something like that. And so that's the new normal. And we've been running on Slack. We used Skype initially, but then we've been running with Slack for ages, like 8 years or something. You're not trying to replicate in-person conversation. You actually, I think for me, looking to use in-person conversation in a very specific way, which is to build the trust, which then allows you to operate in a hybrid or fully remote way for extended periods of time.
Interesting.
That's what it feels like to me. So that when you get together, you might not do any work as such. You might just like have a whiteboard session and throw some ideas around. You might have some lunch. You might just shoot the breeze or whatever. The point there is we're not talking about trust building exercise. We're not talking about that nonsense, right? But the things that end up mean that you get to know someone and how they tick, so that when you're remote, that you know that someone's going to make decisions in the best interest of the people who are involved in that particular area. But yeah, it's interesting to think through like all of these dynamics, and that's interested me for ages. Like all of that kind of stuff. The relationship between different tools, ways of working, different kind of messaging, and it coming from a software background, you're thinking about APIs, application programming interface. We get it, right, like in terms of building software. Yeah. But that is a very weird way of thinking for lots of people. The idea of specifying how to communicate and only being able to communicate through a particular well-formed protocol. Some people can't do it at all. They want to get on the telephone and have like an arbitrary call, like a random call with someone else and just discuss it. And the value of locking things down into a well-formed shape, some people don't get at all. And obviously coming from software, we get it. Yeah. That's like kind of go-to way of thinking about it. And that's obviously what helps things to scale. So we're really trying to live this stuff and think through the implications on a day by day basis, and some of the future stuff that comes out of the Team Topologies and the kind of Conflux sort of space will almost certainly be around this, around kind of organizational operating models and scaling and ways of working together at multiple different levels of the organization, stuff like this. I don't know yet, but this is the kind of stuff we're living every day, and we're working on it with our customers. And for me, it's super interesting. It really is.
Yeah.
Like at the intersection of lots of different things.
Yeah. I mean, one is I actually find it intriguing myself. Two, though, the COVID thing and the digital thing. Even being an ex, kind of programmer and worked in the industry, I really do like being around people. So it's very difficult. I find it really difficult because it's not necessarily. I think you were spot on when you were saying when people come together, you're not actually there to try and be productive on those days when it's hybrid, right? Because you're not together very often. So you are like whiteboarding or doing the softer stuff. But the dynamic of the team does alter when they've been around each other, because they've kind of behaviorally understood one another differently than like, which you can't quite. I mean, maybe you can do it sometimes, but it's like much harder to get to know somebody digitally and remotely. It takes a lot more effort, and you don't see, when the camera's off and someone's like walked off and done a thing, you obviously don't get to see them outside of the conversation or their nuances or their body language as much. And you definitely do notice, and it maybe is trust in the end, but it's like a comfortability with one another in the team when they're then remote, and it does transfer, and there's a bit more of a relaxed, kind of element, or at least more collaborative, because some people are less collaborative sometimes by accident digitally because it's harder to kind of collaborate, so.
I think it has it's got implications for scaling, because it kind of then implies, well, if you're going to have people in the same team, you probably need to be able to those people to meet fairly easily on a reasonably regular basis, like every 6 months or something like that, so that it can maintain that sense of trust. And if the team sort of has changed a bit, you need to get those people together again to sort of to reform that trust and to shape the dynamic. But then potentially those folks can run for, I don't know, 3 months or maybe even longer, depending on what the other culture is like in the organization, remotely or hybrid or what have you. But that it feels like that trust needs renewing. I mean, this is not new, right? These kind of social and group dynamics have been known for a very long time, but it's worth reminding ourselves, I think, of what that looks like. But if you talk about scaling an organization, even if the vast majority of work happens, let's say online, which it can do these days, every organization has now got many organizations now have got video conferencing, video call tools, and so on, to make this stuff possible. So a lot of stuff can be done online, but then which bits actually do you deliberately want to put in person in order to build that trust, in order to demonstrate certain things? So you might be able to get, I don't know, 50, 60% of the way there, say even 70, 80% of the way there with digital online approaches. But then there's a chunk which is, somewhere between 10 and 50% which needs in-person, like, bodies in the same room kind of approach at some point. So it's really interesting to think through that dynamic and what the implications of that for scaling organizations and things. Because having all the bodies in, say, San Francisco, it's probably not needed.
Yeah,
that kind of model of the kind of pre-pandemic sort of Silicon Valley stuff is probably not needed. But neither is it everyone is fully remote all the time. That's also probably not actually the most effective way of doing it. And guess what? There's a dynamic in there. And it's not just like it's a halfway house. It's a different thing. It's about a dynamic around it.
Yeah,
you can have people living in the middle of nowhere, but the point is that we're occasionally going to come together. There's a like a dynamic aspect to it. We're going to come together with quite deliberately and use maybe some techniques from, let's say, liberating structures or some other kind of group kind of learning and awareness techniques deliberately to do that in a relatively short space of time, to minimize hotel and travel costs and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
and because people have got home care responsibilities and kids and whatever else, they can't be there for like 2 weeks while we slowly get to know each other. You've got 2 days and that's it. So what you're going to do in that space. So all that kind of stuff is actually quite interesting as well, from like the health of the organization, the health of the individuals, health of teams. All of that dynamic is interesting to start to see emerge as well.
Yeah.
So we're living it, and we're helping our customers kind of work through some of those things too.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You'll have to. I mean, I know you're a busy guy, but you'll have to come back on and keep give it an update. It'd be brilliant to kind of get you back, and also.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
kind of learn what you're doing. Like, it's just good to kind of get a sense of like what you're discovering and things you're trying. And we also have it like, even though we're similar in terms of you practicing what you preach, because you've also got to run. You know, you've got people in your business and they need to operate. So, you know, it is like you firsthand see things, like what's working and what hasn't, even for yourselves, which is the bit like even what you're saying. It's the bit that helps you reflect on how complicated the dynamics of it all are, like how grey it can be. So it's not like it's like, oh, just do A, you'll be fine. You're done. It's success. So it is really interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, thanks a lot for coming on. It's been great. And then if you're in London and you've got time, give us a shout and we'll definitely do a beer or something. Yeah. And you can see Lewis.
That'd be great
as well. You can see Lewis again and see what he's up to.
That'd be great.